First and foremost, the information contained in this video is from the book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years by the late David Graeber. Most of us learn that the process of bartering later progressed into the invention of money. For those of us who don't know what bartering is, a quick illustration is as follows. A fisherman in a village wants eggs. He will swap his extra fish with his neighbor's eggs. But money was invented because there was a problem when the needs and wants of people didn't match. That is, the fisherman wants eggs, but if his neighbor doesn't want fish, the transaction wouldn't work, so they had to invent money to exchange goods and services. This hypothetical scenario is one that is almost always taught in schools. However, according to David Graeber's book, most anthropologists consider this to be myth. Most examples of bartering happen more in modern-day situations, by people that were already using money previously, but had to improvise due to lack of coins. For example, prisoners having to barter first and then using other items as currency, such as cigarettes. The author of the book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, gives a few examples of how something similar to bartering was recorded by ethnographers in various indigenous communities, but he notes that they are normally ceremonial barters and are usually between strangers or enemies, and within such a context, there was always potential for violence and hostility, so the event was usually accompanied with music, dance and other rituals. It is completely different to how bartering is normally described in textbooks. He states that there is a lack of anthropological evidence to show that bartering was the first step towards the development of money. If you think about it, the lack of evidence for the typical textbook scenario of bartering does not seem surprising. Because, in close-knit families and communities, people don't really transact with each other on the basis of exact quantifiable measurements, in order to seek the best bargain. People are less calculating and precise towards the people they are close with, such as family or friends. In small-scale communities, people would approach transactions more like favors or even gifts, owing each other favors of various kinds. And that's pretty much what credit is. Credit is basically something you owe someone else. And evidence indicates that expense accounts, credit and tabs existed long before money, and that is how people actually traded within their communities in early history. The author explains in detail some other examples to illustrate this point. When people first exchanged goods with one another, they did on the basis of credit first. And there is no anthropological evidence to show that bartering resulted in the creation of money. The book illustrates a scenario to help understand how money may have developed. For example, in a village, Joshua gives Henry a pair of shoes. Henry promises that he will give Joshua something of equal value by writing up an IOU contract. Then later, when Henry gets something of equal value, he will give it to Joshua and the contract terminates. Because Henry has fulfilled his obligation to Joshua. The transaction is complete. However, he might decide not to pay back what he owes, but instead use the IOU to buy something from someone else. Joshua could in fact use this IOU to pay Sheila for something he owes her. Now that Sheila has the IOU, Henry needs to pay Sheila instead. Joshua has essentially used Henry's debt to buy something from Sheila. However, say that Sheila wants wheat from Edith. She gives that same IOU to Edith. Now Henry will need to pay Edith. Not Sheila and not Joshua. As long as people trust Henry, this can actually continue circulating indefinitely, until Henry actually pays off the debt, ending the IOU relationship. So, money is an accounting tool to measure something, and the thing you're measuring is debt, or what people owe each other. This may work in a small town where everyone knew each other. But probably won't work in a city with a larger population, where there would be far too many IOUs to keep track of and guarantee. However, this would be possible if there was a king guaranteeing all of the IOUs, or if the person originating the IOU is a king. It won't ultimately matter what form the currency takes, as long as the state or the king accepts it as money, and you can pay your taxes with it. An example would be tally sticks, which were used as a form of currency in King Henry I's reign. Anything could be money, if enough people knew that there was someone willing to accept it as payment, and it can be used to cancel debts. If Henry in our story had used gold instead of IOUs, the gold would still represent Henry's promise to fulfill an obligation to Joshua. That is, the gold in itself is valuable insofar as it represents a promise. Henry's promise and trustworthiness. The value of the unit of money, whether it is an IOU, banknote, or gold, simply measures the trust that individuals have, that the other would fulfill their obligation within the transaction. This view of money is called the chartalist or state theories of money. The story of Joshua and Henry is an analogy of a true story. In 1694, the Bank of England lent £1,200,000 to the king, and in return, the bank had a monopoly on issuing IOUs or banknotes to the people willing to borrow from them or deposit into their banks. This was a pretty good deal for them because they charged the king 8% interest, and also charged interest on the people they issued the IOUs to. In our first story with Henry and Joshua, his IOU can forever be in circulation in the village. The IOU can continue to be used to buy goods and services by people like Sheila and Edith. At each stage of circulation, Henry can terminate the IOU by fulfilling his obligation to whoever has it. So technically money represents the original loan, the debt. Similarly, this loan from the Bank of England to King Henry was never repaid. The evidence found in ancient societies like Mesopotamia actually indicates that virtual money or credit existed first, before coins and other currency. Temples were not only places of religious worship, but were vast financial centers where temple scribes and administrators would facilitate the financial transactions of its people. Temple bureaucrats created the shekel as a form of measuring and keeping track of resources brought by the temple workers. It was a unit of measurement first and later developed into the more familiar coins we see here. Debt was also calculated in silver but could be paid in other things like animals. Peasants would usually pay off their debts in barley. They fixed the ratio of barley to silver. Through the standardization of weights and measures, and creating accounting units, temples facilitated trade and wrote up loan contracts. Most ordinary people transacted on the basis of credit where they would pay during harvest time in barley. So, ancient societies therefore also faced the same risks regarding debt leading to financial crises as we have now. However, in contrast to current times, institutions existed to protect debtors rather than to enforce debt obligations. The objective was to prevent societal collapse and disintegration by providing debt amnesties in certain circumstances. For example, in situations where there was a natural disaster or a bad harvest, and people couldn't pay their debts, there was the risk of total collapse. Too much debt meant that people would simply migrate elsewhere or abandon their farms, and families would end up being separated, especially if family members had to be sold off to pay back their creditors. So, kings would cancel the debt, in order to give people a clean slate to start over. Not only was it to prevent the collapse of their society but also for political reasons, obviously to gain favor from the people. The Rosetta Stone is famous for its role in helping experts decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, because on it, there is inscribed the same exact text 3 times, in 3 written languages: Egyptian hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Ancient Greek. The message on it enshrines debt forgiveness during King Ptolemy V's reign. All debts owed, by the people to the government, were forgiven, and all taxes were also abolished. This wasn't considered radical, and many other societies did the same thing. This practice is also covered in the Old Testament laws, where every 7 years the debts were cleared. The practice also existed in ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian societies. How did gold end up being used as currency? The assumption is that through the markets, gold naturally evolved into money. This is an extension of the belief that bartering was our first method of transacting, and that people started using other durable objects like gold as currency, to overcome the practical difficulties of bartering. And that it is another example of the market coming up with an efficient solution to a problem. However, the insufficiency of this explanation might be overlooked by those who believe that state and market are completely separate. As mentioned earlier in the video, most people within communities didn't really need to barter. So how and why did people begin to use gold and coins as currency, if they were not created to overcome the inconveniences of bartering? The following question is posed: why did kings turn the gold into coins, stamp their faces on it and issue them out to citizens, only to get the same coins back from the citizens in the form of taxes? Why collect taxes at all? Wouldn't a king simply need to take over all the gold mines to have everything he needed, since gold was money? However, a simple explanation is this. Supporting large armies required a huge amount of resources. To feed thousands of soldiers, it would require an insane amount of crops and animals to be transported. And in ancient or medieval times, it was extremely difficult to grow and transport the necessary crops and animals to feed a large army. To solve this problem, a king would require all the villagers in the kingdom to pay the king taxes in the form of coins. The king would then issue these coins to the soldiers. In order to comply with the king's orders, the people in the kingdom would need the coins, and thus were compelled to provide the soldiers with what they need, in order to pay the required tax. This is an example of how a market was created intentionally by the king or state, in order to provide for the army. Most ancient rulers came up with this method of creating markets, because it was an easy way to feed the soldiers, without having to directly ask the people for resources, or produce it themselves on royal estates. The author states that according to the historical records, the market and the state are not opposite to each other. But without the state, there would be no market. A relatively recent example of something similar happening would be the purposeful creation of markets by the French colonialists of Madagascar. During this time, the native Madagascans were required to pay high taxes in Malagasy francs that were issued by the French colonists. The native people had to sell their rice crops to the Chinese and Indian merchants in order to receive the francs to pay their taxes. They would sell their rice during harvest, when the price of rice was the lowest, presumably because harvest time would be when rice is the most plentiful. This would have resulted in a much lower price. But when they sold enough rice to pay the high tax rates, they didn't have enough rice to feed themselves or their families. Ultimately, they had to buy back their own rice from the merchants, later on at the higher price. This meant they were perpetually in debt. They did other jobs to pay back their debts. They also sent their children to the city, in search of work on the French plantations, as cheap labor. The resulting increase in cheap labor reduced the labor costs for the colonizers. However, the author notes, as per historical records, internal documents show that the French colonialists also had the goal of ensuring the native people had some money left over after their taxes were paid. This was in order for the natives to gain a taste for spending money on consumer goods, thereby developing consumer demand. Through the creation of consumer demand for products, the French colonizers aimed to ensure that they would have control over the people, long after they had left the colony. As noted at the beginning of this video, most of this information is from David Graeber's book, Death the First 5,000 Years. This video only has the parts I thought were not only interesting, but also not too difficult to present in a cursory YouTube video format. However, I highly recommend reading the book if you found this video interesting. Thank you for watching.